Busker, co-founder, CTO of Fullcast. Yeah, segmentation, I think, is something that's quite near and dear to our heart. We work a lot, as Tyler mentioned, with our customers through these planning cycles, and I'm sure we have a lot of stories we can add to the discussion today. And I think in terms of us diving into this topic, feel free to, as Ashley said, post your questions. We'll pick those up and sprinkle those throughout the discussion to keep this interactive and lively. With that, Rusty?
Yeah, thanks for having me, everybody. I'm Rusty von Wahlberg. I'm the president of the Spokes Group, and I bring to the Spokes Group experiences from engineering, consulting, a lot of time at Salesforce Square and Motive and other startups, working on growing SaaS businesses. And segmentation is one of the best ways to focus resources and teams. So I was really excited to be here for this conversation. In fact, I was just sharing with the group here that an SMB leader came to me the other day and asked about what do they need to demonstrate to move the segment lines up. I think a lot of people are facing that kind of question about this time of year. And one of the hardest things that I always face is trying to quantify the pressure that the SMB team is putting on that line. Have you guys faced something similar?
Discussion, I think, is quite common in organizations where you have a segment line that is, I think, when initially those lines get drawn, they tend to be drawn quite arbitrarily, and then you have these discussions throughout every planning cycle in terms of, okay, where do the lines need to be, and who's going to gain with that line moving up or down. We used to do, I think when Rusty and I were both at Salesforce, we used to do this thing called a disruption analysis. And the disruption analysis was basically where we update all the data first. So we enrich all the accounts and things like that in the system. And then we figure out, okay, how many accounts actually moved across those lines. And it's interesting to see how quickly or how fast they move across those lines. And then you have to have a discussion around whether we have the right resources to support that kind of growth and whatnot. So there's organic growth where companies cross the lines and move from, say, SMB into your mid-market space. And then you have discussions with sales leaders where they want to adjust the line so that it can benefit the organization in one way or another. And usually there's competing arguments for why you should keep it the same versus why should you move it. And it tends to be fraught with a lot of political angst around it. But I think as RevOps folks, we try to rely on the data to say, okay, are we matching the right resources for the right buying pattern that we're seeing in those segments, right? And that's really what you're trying to do with segmentation at the end of the day.
I think that's spot on, Bala. Segmentation is really a very strategic resourcing conversation, because you want to match the resources that you're investing from SDRs to AEs to SEs to CSMs and even legal teams and the supporting network of what you need in order to close a deal and support a customer to the LTV at the end of the day of those customers. So when I'll use that SMB leader as the example, when they want to raise the line, the finance person in me gets excited because by raising the line, I become more profitable. My productivity of the team starts to grow, especially if some of those SMB accounts can beat their lifetime average life cycle. It becomes wildly profitable. But to your point, Tyler, I think it comes back to the user experience of, are we really going to be able to support a decision-making cycle? And what are the metrics that we use in order to really quantify the disruption? Because with every move of an account, market opportunity moves. And along with that market opportunity should move headcount, should move marketing resources, should move quota at the end of the day. So that SMB leader that wants the line to move from 20 to 25 may not realize they're going to get a lot of quota as that line moves as well.
Get more responsibility, more pressure too. I also thought about, and you use in your original question, you used the word of pressure that's coming from the sales org to make these line changes. And part of this is also, for me, what I see with customers is this isn't just like an annual thing, like where the pressure to change the line exists, but there's also this pressure to update data throughout the year so that accounts can get pulled down or up across the segmentation lines that you might draw. And that's it says they're in France, but actually I found this other thing that's in the UK, so this whole thing should be mine, if you're drawing on employee lines, or if you're drawing on whatever you're doing, you see this jockeying of trying to get accounts above and below the line. And I think it's up to us to really take a step back and going back to what does the customer experience need to be, regardless of whether their employees are over or under the line, and figuring that piece out is really key. And I even struggle with that a little bit with our customers and trying to help them think through, what is it like SMB, that process, what does that need to be? Or what does that mid-market process need to be? And how do you figure out where to like essentially just draw that line in the sand and say, this is the way it is, and we're going to go through this year and not touch it. So I'd actually be curious to hear from the two of you, just how do you begin to like really start to think about drawing a line in the sand and kind of align those resources to your customers?
Yeah, I can take that swing at that one. Paul. I think different businesses segment in different ways. Some of the most prevalent ones out there are Google segments by industry or vertical. Salesforce segments by employee count. The most important thing about how you're going to segment your market coverage model is to really think about that customer experience and the buying metrics, and then segment by what I call a externally visible attribute, something that you can enrich your data set on without having a conversation with the salesperson, with a prospect. That way I can pull data from maybe a D&B or a contact database, so firmographics, demographics, LinkedIn, and I can get a good sense for what is the potential LTV of that prospect. And one reason people get really interested in verticals, it's also a very strong signal of propensity to buy, but it's also objective and knowable. I think where people get into trouble is when they start to mash together externally visible segmentation metrics and propensity to buy metrics. I was working with a team that talked about digital first companies being a segment, and it was really hard to identify digital first, because if you looked at our customer base, it included airlines, it included very digital first SaaS companies, and it was really hard to identify which one is which. Where what we were really talking about is a propensity to buy model on top of a LTV bookings potential model.
That's right, yeah. And I think at the end of the day, and this kind of ties into the question that's up on the board, which is, what are some examples of segmentation that we've seen or recommend? I would slightly ask that question a little bit differently, in the sense that it's really how do you support your customers in their experience interacting with your company? And we find that if you are a mature organization with multiple product lines and things like that, you may find that by product line, you will require different segmentation. Because, for instance, if you have a product-led growth motion in your SMB segments, then you have an entirely different sales interaction or a customer interaction versus an enterprise sale where you might have the core AE along with a number of other specialists that's actually needed to close the deal. And so the selling motion, the way the customer buys, the way the customer is educated on your product, those are all things that should play into how do you want to segment the customers. And my usual barometer for where segments need to exist is typically the buying patterns. And even for what Rusty was mentioning in terms of verticals, why would you think about verticals? And that really comes down to how the customer buys, right? And so how a public sector organization may buy your product would be very different than how, for instance, a financial services company might actually buy your product, right? A very common example is in public sector, you have to go through an RFP process and you have to go through the central buying agencies and things like that, where it might be very different way of how customers purchase in other verticals. And you need to be able to speak the language. So a healthcare company will require you to speak to them in their language, which means that the resources you're going to have to know how to speak that language, have to know how to be able to represent your product into that segment, right? So those are really what you're trying to do. But the North Star is, how is this customer buying? And do we see common clusters of ways in which the customer is buying? And that tends to be the segmentation strategy that you can adapt. But the most common ones, I think we covered some examples of the most common ones that we see are either based on geography, based on where the customer is, where they're headquartered, or whatever the case may be, verticals, industry that they're in, and size. So employee count, annual revenue, and other examples of these tend to be about the size of the organization that you're dealing with. And these are the three most common ways that we've seen customers do segmentation. But needless to say, that's if you are breaking up a market in segmentation. But if you move to how do I segment my customer success resources, right? It tends to be more about LTV and more about your annual recurring revenue and how big of a customer they are in terms of how much they're spending with you. So the segmentation models can actually vary depending on the function that you're looking at, as well as whether you're segmenting the market or whether you're segmenting your customers. So we've seen a variety of all of those things, right? And by role, you could have different segmentation models as well. And again, it's at the end of the day, the reason for doing all of this is to match the customer's buying experience with the resources that we can provide from the organization.
And the biggest thing that I see on our side, just a quick chime in, is the biggest thing that I see that changes the most is the size in terms of what you use and where the lines are drawn to. But like, I've seen customers based on revenue, based on like number of emails that's sent, employees,
marketing spend, digital and IT spend.
Yeah, enrollment size if you're in like public sector or education,
hospital beds.
Yeah, seriously. And that goes back to what Rusty was saying earlier, is you gotta be able to get the data too. And so that's super key. Don't just start carving up segmentation on something that you're gonna make up. You should be able to get it somewhere so that you could actually put these accounts in proper locations. Rusty, you were gonna say something.
Yeah, sorry, Tyler. One hard thing for me in my career was actually decoupling CX segmentation from sales segmentation. I came into this with a really strong, passionate belief to line everything up. That way, AEs wouldn't have to hand off to a very big team. You wouldn't have to know who's who in the zoo. You would have your person. But as I got more into the data, I discovered that CX lines should be different. Sometimes customers are a little bit more needy and expand faster and need a little bit more attention than the sales team gives them. And the CX line should be a lower ratio of CX people to customers. Sometimes they aren't as needy, and the CX line can have a higher ratio. And that kind of blew my mind when I finally got the data and understood the impact of the CX ratios to the sales ratios and what that meant for the overall business.
Yeah. And I think for it's also the maturity of your CX function as well, in terms of the level of support, the level of tools and resources that's available and at their disposal. For instance, when you're a younger organization, your CX team is probably carrying a lot of the load in terms of training and getting people to use, in the SaaS world, use the software, so to speak. But as you mature, you build the resources which allow you to then be more productive and change that ratio a little bit. And so in both cases, in terms of sales as well as in terms of CX, the maturity of the organization and how productive the resources are will also impact how you draw that line. Yeah.
And that's one of the places I've seen segmentation go sideways and planning go sideways, is the organization is so focused on growth. We put a lot of time into where's the pipeline going to come from by segment, in terms of marketing spend, in terms of SDRs, who's going to close that business in terms of AEs and SEs. And then a decision is consciously made to allow CX hiring to lag behind sales as a way to save cash in the short term and self-fund CX. But that comes to a crashing halt when you have a great quarter and all of a sudden you have no people on board to service those new customers, and your churn takes a hit because your existing customers get unhappy with the level of support they're getting. And it's not like you can flip a switch and create a great CX person. Sure. You need to hire them, onboard them, train them. It takes a fair amount of time and investment.
And even with one of the examples I can share is even with something like verticals, right? It really is about matching resources with your segmentation, right? I remember this example where we were trying to create a new vertical for consumer products. Mm-hmm. And we created a CPG vertical. We used all the industry data to say, okay, all this stuff is in CPG, but quickly realized that we don't have enough people to cover all of the companies that would be defined in the vertical. And then what we started doing was chopping off things off the definition of CPG to say, okay, durable goods are not part of it, but non-durable goods would be part of the CPG definition. And so you sort of start to then have to break things down in that way. And sometimes, as you said, it goes sideways because people tend to get too focused on the actual numbers and then forget why they're trying to do this in the first place. And we've seen that happen quite a lot of times as well. So much so that sometimes I get some really interesting ways of segmenting where someone would say, I'm going to divide up by the first letter of the company name, and I'm going to put A to E in a territory, and I'm going to put F to whatever in a territory. And at that point, you really question, what is the purpose? What are you trying to do? Is it just you trying to divide up accounts between reps, or are you actually trying to improve the customer experience at the end of the day? And so it's easy to spot when you've lost the connection to the reason why you're doing this. And so those are the things to watch out for, where you're not doing this just to divide up the accounts between all the reps. You're actually doing this with the customer experience in mind.
Yeah. And I've also seen it where I once launched a manufacturing vertical into a downturn where manufacturing it wasn't buying anything as an industry or as a sector of the economy. So our reps were dying. And in those cases, what was happening in a shadow ops way is managers were giving those reps accounts outside the manufacturing vertical. So when I looked at the data, it looked like my manufacturing team was doing okay. But what I didn't know is at the granular account level, they were selling into accounts that weren't necessarily manufacturing. So one thing to have your eye on is managers who have the ability to reassign accounts will make sure that they're following the fastest path to the money. That's what we pay them for. And even if that dilutes the segmentation, it's probably the right thing for the business, but we need to be explicit about it, or at least instrument it. It wasn't until months later that I discovered that the manufacturing experiment actually had been diluted down so that it was no longer a manufacturing experiment. We had no meaningful data on whether that team was working or not.
I think we have a question, really a follow-on question as it relates to the externally identifiable attributes that we use in segmentation. What have we seen to be the most robust besides geography?
Interesting. Yeah, I think there is no silver bullet, is the way I would put it. All externally produced data, in my experience, is minimum 6 months old. And so you're looking at data to enrich and do the segmentation. And it really comes down to how volatile some of these things are. And typically, addresses tend to be less volatile compared to number of employees or annual revenue, because that changes all the time. And verticals tend to be fairly stable. So if you're looking at data, I think the aspect that you want to keep an eye on is how volatile is that, and how the volatility actually impacts your segmentation, right? One example that I can share is this was at a time when Uber was just growing really crazy in terms of the number of employees, and they basically skipped 3 segments that we had defined because they grew so much in like 6 months, right? And what we had was a mismatch where an SMB rep was trying to sell into a 10,000 person organization or whatever the size was at that time. And those are some of the things that you want to keep an eye on. And we had created an exception mechanism to identify and fix those things. But again, the data, as Rusty said, you want to get third-party data, you want to bring them in and use it for your segmentation. But again, the data is as good as the provider and as good as the matching logic that you have in that data. And it varies by region. Typically, you tend to get really good data in the US, really good data in Europe. But if you go to South America or APAC, depending on the country, the data is not that great, right? And so it'll come back with guesstimates on employee counts and come back with guesstimates on annual revenue, because there's no recording mechanism for those things in certain countries. You really have to analyze this segment by segment and say, are we using the right metric and attribute to do that?
Yeah, I really like the way you flagged volatility in the data, Bala, because things like revenue, number of employees, locations are tied very closely to taxes. And tax data tends to be some of the more robust. So I think that firmographics fall into that ilk. One thing to remember is that industry is self-reported. So whenever I've carved up an industry team, I get some wonky results because the companies defined their industry maybe 10, 20 years ago when they were first incorporated, and that may not match the business they're in today. So I think it's important to have an exception process, sometimes even with the title of the company being part of that exception.
Right.
But I think there's also a way to leverage that volatility. The one thing I've seen recently is a lot of tracking of stakeholders. So as people move companies, there's a lot of tools out there to understand, help people move from role to role within a company and from role to role between companies, especially if they've used similar software, your software in the past. That's a very powerful relationship to have.
Right.
This is mostly from you, Bala. You've started this whole thing with the industry stuff, and Rusty had like triggered this memory of just like us always talking about how industry is also really difficult in the sense that you want to think of like a company and an industry to be one-to-one, but a lot of times it's not. And Bala's always used the classic example of Microsoft, and you could probably think about Microsoft and probably categorize Microsoft into like 5 to 10 different industries, like gaming, software, hardware, whatever else is out there, like productivity software, if you get into the details. And that's another thing that you got to deal with is when you're starting to think about your industry data, is figuring out not only where I'm getting this from might be a little bit different than another place, because ZoomInfo might come up with its own industry classification than DMB, and then there's NAICS and SIC, and certainly thinking through those things and making sure stuff's categorized properly is key, but it's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Guess is my point.
And that's the reason for the exception process, right? You want to be able to catch those things and fix them again with the eye of the customer experience. I cannot tell you, when I ran ops, I cannot tell you how many people would create issues to say, this is my account because it has this attribute related to it. And then they will argue because there's a rich opportunity at the end of it, right? And typically those emotions don't come up until there is an identified opportunity. Nobody fights over prospects' accounts where there's no business to be found. But as soon as an opportunity comes up, you'll hear arguments on different sides of the sales business. And you want to have a pretty cleanly defined policy when you're trying to address those things, right? You don't want to do those arbitrarily. You don't want to do those ad hoc. You want to be able to point at defined policies for how you handle where does something fall in terms of the segment line or the vertical line, right? I remember this conversation I had between two SVPs at Salesforce, where we had a financial services team and we had a healthcare team. And the question was, where does a healthcare insurance company fall? And there's argument about, they buy like a healthcare company, but they're an insurance company, they're a finance company, right? And so you had these two teams that were fighting for these accounts. And the poor RevOps analyst at the end of it was stuck with trying to decide where to put this account. And so you want to be careful about those things as well. Once you define the segment lines, make sure you have a clean policy and exception handling mechanism to deal with these kinds of issues that will invariably pop up.
I empathize with that poor RevOps person. And I think that really leads to the importance of a strong routing tool, because that's where segmentation becomes real. And I remember doing even name of the company based routing. If it contains X, then it's a financial services company. Otherwise, I treat it as the general pool. And your routing rules really need to match your territory assignment rules. Otherwise, it ends up in the hands of a RevOps analyst or a manager who ends up being your router. And that ends up being a lousy experience for both, but it also slows down some of your key metrics like time to lead. If somebody comes in through your website and is in that murky gray zone, it could be a day before you respond to them. Or maybe it even drops on the floor because that manager just doesn't want to deal with the headache. And those sorts of situations leave money on the table. So it's critical that you have a routing tool that is at least as sophisticated as your territory assignment and segmentation tools.
Sorry, Tyler, I think you're on.
Sorry, I was just saying, I agree. I think it's really, then this goes back to, this is very tactical for me, just because this is something I've spent a lot of time with our customers on, and it is really important to make sure you get order of operations in place, or your process for routing in place, because there's a bunch of things that also need to happen, particularly around your data, to get that stuff squared away before you actually route. Routing super important. Segmentation, and in accordance to your segmentation, is really key, because I can't tell you how many times that we've routed something and reps are like transferring it 5 times afterwards because they decide that it needs to be somewhere else or whatever. And that can be because, one, your routing is not aligned to your go-to-market, and so reps are just trying to figure out who it really should belong to. And 2, you haven't fully thought about that full process where, okay, lead gets created, we need to make sure it's been enriched properly, it's got all the correct data to route it correctly. And sometimes that gets skipped, and you'll see we'll route it immediately, and then it'll get enriched, and then so somebody started working it, but actually it's the wrong person, so now it needs to go back, and that of course leads to a poor experience for the customer.
I that's so real. It's unbelievable. I don't know how many times we've had to deal with this situation in my working history on this, is where you have an account that shows up and you don't enrich the data. It looks like it's an SMB account because there's no subsidiary information on the account. You end up routing it to the SMB team. They go and they close a business on it because it's a fast transaction. They close the business on it, and then you enrich the data at the end of the day, find out it should have been an enterprise account because it's a subsidiary of an enterprise company. And then the enterprise rep goes, that should have been my credit. And so then you end up doing quota credits to people all over the place across the organization and trying to manage all that. It's just a nightmare. And so thanks for pointing that out, Tyler, that the order of operations in that context is super important.
I've also seen the order of operations create analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Because I refer to a Salesforce instance as a lot like my garage. I can keep it orderly but not clean. And to wait until my data is perfect to put a router in place or to do assignment rules, I think is an objective that'll never get reached. So I always argue to start small. Process and policy are fractal in nature. So put something out there, start routing against it, and then add to it over time, rather than build a very sophisticated rules of engagement and have a monolithic lift in terms of implementing these rules. Start small. Start with a single attribute and build from there.
Absolutely.
They have a question.
Cool.
So basically, we've talked about CS and sales segmentation and how they should be different. This person is curious about what we've seen regarding marketing and how marketing gets involved in segmentation. What have we seen work well or not regarding collaboration across these functions?
I think we touched on a little bit between sales and CX in terms of the actual experience of the customer. I keep using that word over and over again because I think it's super important. And we find that the way that we would support a customer may actually be based on factors that have nothing to do with where they're located or what their employee count might be. And so there is a distinction to be drawn to say, okay, this is a customer of this type, and therefore the support that we need to provide to them looks very different than how we might say break down a market into prospects and customers that we can go sell into. In much the same way, marketing, I think, has a similar aspect to it. Clearly, we want all these organizations working with each other as far as the customer experience is concerned. However, that does not mean that they all should look at the customer in the exact same segmentation. Because I think as a marketing organization, you want the air cover, you want the support of marketing, especially going beyond just the initial sales or the top of the funnel process. Because if you're looking at a SaaS company, then most of the operations that you're doing to actually make money is after the sale is done. And you need marketing support and cover to actually support those functions as well. And so what I've seen is marketing take the perspective of areas of presence, competitive pressure in certain segments. They might actually consider a bunch of vectors which have nothing to do with how you would divide up the market in terms of how they're going to do their events or how they're going to do their actual campaigns and what kind of campaigns they're going to drive. Language, for instance, is a big factor in marketing, right? So when you're in Europe, when you're sending out ads in German, you want to segment all the dot countries together so you can have an easy way of distributing your ads. So those are kind of factors. I think from a marketing standpoint, you want to make sure that they are able to identify the ideal customer and reach out to them in ways, and they tend to be more focused on contacts as opposed to accounts. And so that's another major differentiator is they might target the individuals that are in these roles that are moving from company to company and actually measure that relationship and target that relationship irrespective of what the size of the company might be, right? And so I think that's the key thing to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, you want smooth handoffs between all of these organizations from a customer perspective, but that does not mean that the segmentations have to be uniform between these organizations.
I think another key element when I think of sales versus marketing versus CX is what is the work to be done? And I'll just use marketing as the example is and I'll continue using small versus large accounts. In a small account, marketing can actually generate pipeline with scalable marketing tools like SEM campaigns. That generates a meaningful portion of an SMB account executive's pipeline, where those same Google ads don't move the needle for an enterprise sales team, but events and executive dinners really do. So I think as you're segmenting, it's critical to call out not only make sure the resources are balanced by function, but really define the work to be done and at what stage of the sales cycle it hits. Is it top of the funnel? Is it mid funnel? Is it late funnel? Because that will make sure everybody's expectations are hit and there's no disconnects, because I've seen situations where marketing might be on the hook for a large portion of an enterprise or even a mid-market team's pipeline, and they just don't have that lever to pull. No matter how much money they spend, they can't get there. And that needs to be explicit up front. What they are better at than the sales team is acting on sort of intent data. If somebody attends an event, marketing can find that group of people with a specific title in mind inside a certain industry, inside a certain group of accounts, and follow them across the internet in a way that salespeople just don't have the capacity to do. So that way, marketing can be a powerful ally on crossing segmentation and intent and really boost the propensity to buy and close rates.
Absolutely.
I'm curious because this was interesting. We talked a lot about marketing, but we've left SDRs out of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like customer wise, we're probably 50-50 split between SDRs rolling into sales and SDRs rolling up into marketing. And given the split between the two, have either of you seen differences in segmentation among SDRs or alignment of SDRs to AEs if they are rolling up into marketing? Do you see, I guess the point that I'm getting at, and I was like thinking about this while you're talking, and I haven't really come to a conclusion on this, which is why I'm asking this question, is just if SDRs are reporting into marketing, do they typically align more and the segmentation gets more similar to what marketing's doing? Or is it still something that you're trying to like bridge the gap so that you're passing these marketing leads to SDRs and then SDRs and on?
I think I'll take a swing at it. Is the MQL to SQL link is many to many. So there's not much relationship that matters there, because one campaign getting to an SDR is just as good as another campaign or a list of targets versus another target. What matters most is the SDR to AE relationship, especially as the account sizes grow, because you divide and conquer the work of I'm going to take this division, or I need your help breaking into this department over here, or let's go invite so-and-so to a baseball game. That's a lot of work, and that gets divvied up in between the AE and the SDR to do account-based marketing, for lack of a better phrase. So that relationship between the SDR and the AE is a critical thing. That can exist whether or not the SDRs roll up to sales or marketing. The question I end up asking more is, how does the career pathing work? Because the sales leader ultimately will be more interested in an SDR's career path if they're in that person's organization, and making sure that people are responding to the SQOs that the SDRs are flipping over, where if it's across the functional lines, I see a lot of pushback on, that's not a qualified meeting yet. It doesn't meet these mid-pick criteria or this or that. So it becomes, in both cases, very important to have objective criteria for a qualified meeting set. But I always end up erring on putting SDRs in the sales org for the career pathing reason.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think one of the interesting things is in most SDR organizations, that what I've seen is an alignment based on, as Rusty pointed out, the work that's actually being done. If you have a need for a coordinated ABM type work, outbound or inbound, then making sure that the teaming alignment between the rep and the SDR, typically it's one to many, from SDR to many sales rep. And that needs to be a manageable level. So you can't have one SDR teaming with 35 reps. It doesn't work. But if it's a manageable amount, then you can achieve that efficiency of the team working together. However, in most cases, what I've seen is SDRs tend to be pools of people that are aligned at a macro segmentation level. So more like a region or a district or something like that you would make the alignment on. And then you have a pool of people in the SDR org that's actually dealing with the inbounds or the outbound activity. That tends to be, I've seen, it's like hybrid between that. But in most of those cases, it's the SQL to MQL transition tends to work well. As Rusty said, if it's part of the same organization, I also prefer the SDR organizations to be part of sales, because to Rusty's point, that gives them a career path. A lot of SDRs are on their path to becoming reps and AEs, and it gives them a way to get there.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've seen a little bit of lately is SDRs actually outnumbering AEs. And that's really interesting, because I think it brings us back to something that we're all really focused on, is what does that mean in terms of the outcomes? Because an SDR should be measured alongside any other campaign for pipeline generation in terms of attribution analysis. So if your cost of an SDR is lower than your cost of a marketing campaign, go for it. Have 2 SDRs for every AE, but it needs to be an efficient use of funds, and it makes sense in terms of the attribution analysis of, are they actually generating the pipeline? Can we attribute it back to them in terms of the work that they're doing? And that really defines the SDR ratios across segments, is coming back to that, the indexed attribution analysis, so that you can really compare a dollar is a dollar, whether or not I put it into the SDR team or the marketing team or the partner team.
Yep. We're all going to sit in silence until someone asks a final question here.
We're all in violent agreement. We're all nodding our heads along with each other. Trying to think of something really.
I think here's the biggest thing for me, and we do have a new question, so we'll hit this, but this is a short point. And for me, and this is just experience with customers, don't be afraid to make a bunch of different segmentation for your different roles, because it warrants it, right? And we talked about the split between CS doesn't need to be the same segmentation as sales. And if you have other roles that, like renewals or channel or whatever else it is, doesn't need to perfectly align to whatever your sales is. And don't be afraid to break that up if it makes sense. Again, if it doesn't make sense, then going back to the SDR AE relationship, then it might make more sense to try and keep those partnerships together, because in that sense, they're developing a relationship, that they're like understanding how each of them work, and they're working closely together on those accounts, whereas maybe elsewhere they're not, and it makes more sense to break stuff up. So don't just think about sales and CS, but think about all of the different roles, and if it makes sense to go for a different segmentation, then do it, because it can be done. So
one of the extreme examples I've seen of that, Tyler, is a new product launch. Actually pulling a small SWAT team of SDRs out and putting them on that product for a period of time to sell into either new logos or sell into the base. And they're just living and breathing that product for a period of 3 or 6 months. And I think that really highlights everything that we were just talking about, is making sure their quotas reflect that new mission, making sure you're not wrecking the rest of the business by pulling their capacity out, and having a plan for bringing them back into the core team, because that flex to launch a new product or initiative might be super impactful for the business, but also very disruptive once when you take them out, and again when you bring them back. So that agility makes a big impact on how successful you can be.
yeah. All right. How should segmentation change over time? What are examples of changes we've seen and why they were made?
COVID, for one, right, is a great example of something external that actually forces people to reevaluate segmentation. Certain markets were not doing well, certain markets were doing really well. And we've seen a number of our customers basically go back and relook at where the resources were being pointed at and say, okay, in this sort of a segment, we need to focus on these verticals or these market areas versus somewhere else. So there are external triggers that would make you rethink segmentation. The other thing that I've seen is experimentation. And so what I mean by that is sometimes you have a hypothesis, you have, so this is especially true of organizations that are growing, are areas that you want to try or different sales programs that you want to try. And for that reason, you might set up a team. As Rusty said, an example would be a new product launch or a new market that you're going into this year. And all of those are, in most part, trial and error, because you don't actually have data to prove that it would work, but you're trying it out. And so you might actually do that for 6 months, see if it works. If it doesn't, then move things around or change things around. So it's not necessarily a build it once and everything is set in stone for the year. You're constantly tweaking and changing things to allow for this sort of matching of resources to where you want the business to go. Clearly, external factors trigger a lot of that change, but it could very well be something internal as well, in terms of areas of focus, new products, new markets, new marketing campaigns, new promotions. Like those things also drive changes that are more temporary or sometimes even permanent, that helps drive this.
One thing. Sorry, go ahead. No, you got it.
I think along with these experimentations, I want to emphasize the employee experience alongside the customer experience. Because if I think about that new product launch, we usually tap the top performing SDRs on the shoulder of, hey, I want you to help me launch this new product. So you're taking your top performers, putting them into a risky experiment, and then asking them maybe to change their manager, to change the AEs they're working with, totally disrupt their world. And they may or may not be successful there despite their talent and very hard work. And then we're going to disrupt them again to bring them back. So as much as we're thinking about the business, experimenting, data gathering, and trying things out, I have a deep empathy for the employee experience and making sure that's successful and that people are advancing their careers as being part of these experiments that we craft.
Absolutely.
So for me, and we'll then wrap up, for me, I think the big things that I see in terms of really actually the biggest thing that I think is like hidden that ends up being like a segmentation change is this point where it's always products, right? I think products are like the biggest impact or the trigger point for when you might want to change your segmentation. But one thing we did see recently was segmentate enough. There were like too many products, and then they decided to group like products together and resegment around a grouping of products. So if you went from, let's say, 10 products and you grouped 5 of your products together into 2 separate groups, and then you put your teams in alignment with that. So those are things to think about as you grow products. You might want to start to think about grouping them closer, like grouping them together so that a rep or teams can specialize in the grouping of products. Some other stuff that I've seen in terms of changing segmentation, and now that I'm talking, it's completely escaped me because I just went all in on the product front. So maybe it'll come back to me. I don't know. Ashley, I'll probably pass that back over to you at this point.
That's just fine. Great. So we have 2 minutes left. I'm thinking if we can get a silver bullet, is that what we want to call this, out of everyone? Like one thing that is, if somebody could walk away from this talk and learn something from you about your insights into segmentation, why it's important, etc., maybe you can give us a very quick take on that. Rusty, can I put you on the hot seat?
these, like Bala was saying, segmentation decisions are often fairly political in nature. They're fairly disruptive in nature. So it's important to really be communicative about why you're approaching these decisions, the impact on the business, the logic that goes into them. And then when you launch it, actually laying out a very detailed business case for everybody involved. It's not a case of you're the rep and we're strategy and ops, take this decision. This is an important opportunity to sell this decision to the team. So it's important to communicate. I've even seen people purposefully leak these decisions ahead of time, along with some of the data that goes with it, just to make sure it's not a surprise at the turn of the fiscal.
Awesome.
I
Bala?
think from my perspective, if once you finish this exercise, if you cannot in a short sentence explain the logic behind the segmentation and how that matches up with the customer experience, then I think you should go and rethink it again. Because that simple explanation, I think, is something that you have to keep in mind always as to why the segmentation is being done the way that you're doing it. It's very easy to get super complex and tactical in terms of how you're doing it. But if you can't tell the rep, we did this because this is what the company believes and this is what will match the customer's buying experience, then I think you should rethink it.
Great.
I
Tyler,
was
you
customer experience, but of course, Bala stole that from me. So I think what was interesting, and I'll take this from Rusty, is just, and I never really think about it, but is the employee experience as well. And I've just always been so focused on the customer side. What is it for the customer? But if you're constantly making shifts around to try and optimize for customer experience, what is it like also for the employees? So being cognizant of that is super important.
Perfect. Great. Thank you all for those insights. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the next session in the series. And actually, it's interesting, Tyler, you started to talk about this at the end, talking about product decisions for your annual planning process that revolve around the product and how you're integrating those questions into your overall go-to-market strategy. So next week, we have Sean Lane. He is now a founding partner at Minot Light Consulting and also does the Operations podcast. We're super happy to have him on. So tune in for that one. Again, Rusty, thank you so much for sharing your time. A lot of great insights from everyone today. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you.
Had a lot of fun.
So yeah.
All right. Bye.